My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, interrupting the silence of my apartment. The number wasn't saved in my contacts, but I recognized the area code. Ohio, somewhere I hadn't thought about in years. Hello? Emily? Is that you? The voice caught me off guard, familiar but strained in a way that made my chest tighten. Sandra? I gripped the phone harder, moving away from the counter. How did you get my number? I found it. Listen, I know we haven't talked in forever, but I need you to come here. To Millbrook. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. 3 years. 3 years since she'd stopped returning my calls, since our friendship had ended without explanation or closure. I'd spent months trying to figure out what I'd done wrong before finally accepting that Sandra Williams had decided she was done with me. Sandra, I don't understand. Where's Millbrook? Why are you... Please. Her voice cracked, and I heard something in it that made me pause. Desperation. Fear. I can't explain over the phone, just... Can you come? Today? I looked around my empty apartment, at the stack of ungraded papers on my coffee table, at the weekend that stretched ahead with nothing but routine to fill it. My best friend, former best friend, was asking for help after years of silence. Where in Ohio? About 2 hours south of Columbus. I'll text you the address. The line went quiet except for her breathing, which sounded uneven, like she was trying not to cry. Okay, I said before I could think better of it. I'll leave in an hour. Thank you. Thank you so much. I know I don't deserve... I'll see you soon. I hung up and stared at my phone until the screen went dark. My reflection looked back at me from the black surface, and I wondered what exactly I'd just agreed to. The drive took longer than Sandra had estimated. Millbrook turned out to be one of those small Ohio towns that existed mainly to support the farming communities around it. Main Street consisted of a handful of shops, a diner, and a gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. GPS led me through residential streets lined with modest houses, each with generous yards and the kind of established trees that suggested the neighborhood had been here for decades. Sandra's house sat at the end of Maple Street, a simple 2-story structure with white siding and green shutters. The lawn needed cutting, and paint peeled around the window frames. A rusty swing set sat in one corner of the backyard, visible through a gap in the fence. I parked behind a blue sedan that had seen better days and sat for a moment, trying to prepare myself for whatever version of Sandra I was about to meet. The Sandra I remembered had been vibrant, always laughing, the kind of person who made everyone around her feel more interesting. We'd been close through college, planning our futures together, sharing everything. Until suddenly we weren't. The front door opened before I reached it. I barely recognized her. Sandra's dark hair hung past her shoulders, unwashed and tangled. The bright blue eyes I remembered were sunken now, surrounded by dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights. She'd lost weight, enough that her clothes hung loose on her frame. But what struck me most was her energy. She couldn't seem to hold still, fingers picking at her shirt, moving from foot to foot like she was fighting the urge to run. "Hi, Sandy?" The old nickname slipped out automatically. She pulled me into a hug that felt different than I remembered. Desperate, clinging. When she stepped back, her eyes darted past me to look around the street before focusing on my face again. "You came. I wasn't sure you would. You sounded like you needed help." She nodded quickly, too quickly, and waved for me to follow her inside. The house smelled like dinner, something with onions and garlic. But underneath that was something else. Staleness, like windows that hadn't been opened in weeks. "William," Sandra called out as we entered the living room. "Emily's here." The furniture was mismatched but clean, clearly second-hand pieces arranged to make the space work rather than look pretty. Children's toys were scattered across the carpet. Blocks, stuffed animals, picture books with worn covers. A man came out from what I assumed was the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. William Williams was taller than I'd expected, with short dark hair and a beard that needed trimming. His brown eyes met mine briefly before looking away, and his handshake was quick, perfunctory. "Nice to meet you," he said, though his tone suggested he found the situation anything but nice. "William, this is M, my friend from college I told you about." He nodded but didn't smile. I got the impression that Sandra mentioning me hadn't been a positive conversation. "Dinner's almost ready," he said to Sandra, then looked at me again. I didn't know we were having company. I asked Emily to visit. We have a lot to catch up on. The tension between them was obvious enough that I felt awkward witnessing it. William folded the dish towel with precise movements, his jaw tight. "I'll set another place," he said, and disappeared back into the kitchen. "Don't mind him," Sandra said, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "He's been working long hours at the plant, tired, you know." Before I could respond, the sound of small feet thundered down the stairs. 3 children appeared in quick succession, the oldest leading the charge. "Mommy, Mommy, Nate took my truck." "Did not." "Did too." Sandra's whole demeanor changed. She knelt down to their level, but instead of the warm maternal response I expected, she studied each child's face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Her eyes moved between them like she was looking for something specific. Something wrong. "Billy, give Nate a turn with the truck. You can play with it after dinner." Her voice was careful, measured. The oldest boy pouted, but handed over a small red toy truck to his brother. Both boys had their father's brown eyes and sandy hair, though Billy's was lighter. The youngest, a little girl with soft brown hair and pigtails, hung back near the stairs, watching me with curiosity. "These are my babies," Sandra said, standing up but keeping her eyes on them. "Billy's 4, Nate's 3, and this is Mary. She just turned 2. Mary toddled over to Sandra and raised her arms to be picked up. Sandra lifted her daughter, but even then, she was watching the boys, tracking their movements around the room. "They're beautiful," I said, because they were. Healthy, normal-looking kids who seemed well cared for despite the obvious tension in the house. "Billy, Nate, say hi to Miss Emily." Both boys mumbled hellos without much enthusiasm before returning to their argument over toys. Mary buried her face in Sandra's shoulder, suddenly shy. I tried to match this scene with the Sandra I'd known. She'd always been great with kids, natural and playful. But watching her now, I noticed how she never fully relaxed, even with her own children. Her eyes constantly moved between them, and her free hand picked at her shirt sleeve. "Why don't you boys go wash up for dinner?" Sandra said. As the children headed upstairs, Sandra's attention followed them until they disappeared from view. Only then did she turn back to me, and I saw something in her expression that made my stomach twist. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "After dinner. There's something I have to tell you. Something important." "Sandra, what's going on? You look—" "After dinner," she repeated, her voice carrying an urgency that cut off my question. "Please, just let's get through dinner first." William's voice called from the kitchen, announcing that food was ready. Sandra moved Mary on her hip and took me toward the dining room, but I caught her looking back toward the stairs one more time, as if making sure the boys were really gone. Whatever had made Sandra call, whatever had brought me to this small Ohio town, I was beginning to understand that it was more serious than a simple get-together between old friends. The Sandra I remembered wouldn't have needed to ask for help. She'd been confident, capable, the one people turned to when they needed support. This Sandra was scared of something. And based on the way she watched her own children, that something involved them. William went upstairs around 9:30, saying he had an early shift at the plant. The kids had been in bed for an hour, and I'd helped Sandra clean up the dinner dishes while we made small talk about nothing important. She kept looking toward the ceiling whenever footsteps made noise overhead, following William's movement through the house until we heard the bedroom door close. "Now we can talk," Sandra said, drying her hands on a dish towel with more force than necessary. She led me through the kitchen to a door I hadn't noticed before, partially hidden behind the refrigerator. The basement stairs were narrow and steep, the kind that made you grip the handrail whether you wanted to or not. Sandra flicked on a single overhead bulb that cast harsh light across unfinished walls and concrete floors. The basement felt like a place where people stored things they didn't want to think about. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, some labeled in faded marker, others sealed with packing tape that had yellowed with age. A washer and dryer buzzed in one corner, and the air smelled like detergent mixed with something earthier. Dampness, maybe, or just the smell of a house that had been lived in for decades. Sandra walked to the far end of the room where a metal cabinet stood against the wall. She pulled a key from her pocket and unlocked it with hands that wouldn't stop moving. "Sandra, what's going on? You've been acting strange all evening." She turned to face me, and I saw something in her expression that made me want to back toward the stairs. Her eyes had a glassy quality, like she was looking through me rather than at me. "Something's going to happen tonight," she said. "At midnight. I've been watching, paying attention to the signs, and it's going to be tonight." "What's going to happen?" "The hunt." She said it like the word should mean something to me. "They come for children, Em. Specific children. Mine." I watched her hands shake as she reached into the cabinet. The movement reminded me of someone with too much caffeine, but this felt different, more desperate. "Sandra, you're scaring me. What hunt? Who's they?" "I know how this sounds. I know you think I'm being paranoid or crazy or whatever, but I need you to listen." She pulled something from the cabinet, and my breath caught when I saw what it was. A butcher knife. The blade was maybe 8 inches long, with a black handle that looked well used. She held it carefully, like she knew how to use it. "I think one of my children isn't mine anymore." The words hung in the basement air, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I think something took one of them and left something else in their place. An imposter. It looks like my child, talks like my child, but it's not." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I've been watching them, studying them, and I can tell. Little things. The way Billy holds his head sometimes, or how Nate doesn't laugh at the same things anymore. And Mary." She trailed off, her gaze moving to something I couldn't see. "Sandra, that's..." I started, but she cut me off. "I know what you're going to say. Postpartum depression, anxiety. That's what William thinks too, when he bothers to think about it at all." Her fingers tightened around the knife handle. "But this isn't in my head, Em. This is real." I watched her face, looking for any sign of the Sandra I'd known in college. The girl who'd helped me through organic chemistry, who'd stayed up all night with me when my grandmother died, who'd been the most practical person I knew. This Sandra looked at me with eyes that moved around the room, like she expected something to jump out of the shadows. "Even if that were possible," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "What would you do about it?" She reached back into the cabinet and pulled out a shotgun. It was older, with a wooden stock that had been polished smooth. She handled it like she knew what she was doing. "I have to protect the real ones. Before midnight, before the hunt gets stronger." She walked toward me, holding the knife out handle first. "I need your help." I stared at the knife without taking it. "Sandra, you're talking about your children, your babies." "I'm talking about protecting my babies." Her voice rose, and I heard footsteps creak overhead. We both froze until the sound faded. "One of those things upstairs isn't mine, and if I don't figure out which one, they're all going to be in danger." "Listen to yourself. You're talking about hurting children. I'm talking about saving them." The knife trembled in her outstretched hand. "You don't understand what it's like, watching them every day, knowing that something's wrong but not being able to prove it, seeing your child's face but knowing it's not really them behind those eyes." I looked at the knife, then at the shotgun she held against her side, then back at Sandra's face. Her expression was desperate in a way that made me think of cornered animals. She believed every word she was saying. "Sandra, I think you need help. Professional help. This could be postpartum psychosis or don't." Her voice went flat, dangerous. "Don't try to explain this away with medical terms. I'm not sick, Em. I'm a mother protecting her children." The basement felt smaller suddenly, the walls closer together. Sandra stood between me and the stairs, and I realized I'd let her lead me down here without thinking about how isolated we were from anyone who might hear if things went wrong. "If you won't help me willingly," she said, still holding the knife toward me, "then I'll have to handle this myself. But I called you because I thought you'd understand. Because you cared about me once." I looked at her face, really looked at it, and saw something that made my chest tight. Fear. Not just paranoid fear about imaginary threats, but the bone-deep terror of a mother who believed her children were in mortal danger. Whether or not her beliefs made sense, whether or not they were based in reality, she was operating from a place of absolute conviction. And she was armed. "What exactly do you want me to do?" I asked. "Help me figure out which one isn't mine. Watch them, really watch them, and help me see what I might be missing." She pressed the knife into my hands before I could pull away. The handle was cold against my palm. "We need to identify the imposter before midnight, before the hunt comes for the real ones." I held the knife loosely, not gripping it, but not dropping it either. Sandra watched my face, looking for agreement or resistance, and I realized I was balanced on some kind of edge. Whatever choice I made in the next few seconds would determine how the rest of this night played out. The smart thing would be to refuse, to try to get upstairs and call for help. But Sandra had the shotgun, and 3 children slept in bedrooms above us, completely unaware that their mother was planning to test them for authenticity. If I refused to help, what would she do? If I tried to leave, would she let me? "Okay," I said quietly. "Show me what you mean." Relief flooded her face, and she lowered the shotgun slightly. "Thank you. I knew you'd understand once I explained." I nodded, though understanding was the last thing I felt. What I felt was trapped, standing in a basement with a woman who'd lost touch with reality, holding a knife I never wanted to touch, agreeing to help check her children for signs that they weren't human. Sandra moved toward the stairs, motioning for me to follow. "We'll start by watching them sleep. Sometimes you can tell more when their guard is down." I followed her up the stairs, wondering what exactly I'd just agreed to do, and how I was going to keep 3 children safe from their own mother's crazy ideas. Back upstairs, the house felt different. Sandra moved through the rooms like she was conducting some kind of inspection, checking window locks and peering through curtains while I followed behind her, still holding the knife because I didn't know where to put it down without making things worse. "We need to separate them," Sandra said, turning away from the living room window. "Keep them in different rooms, so if one of them tries to signal the others, we'll know." My stomach twisted. "Sandra, they're sleeping. They're just kids. That's exactly why we need to do this now while they're not expecting it." She headed toward the stairs, the shotgun still in her hands. "The imposter will try to communicate with its handlers once the hunt begins. If we keep them apart, we can monitor each one individually." I followed her upstairs, the knife in my grip. The hallway was dark except for a small nightlight plugged into the wall socket near the bathroom. 3 bedroom doors stood partially open, and I could hear the soft breathing of sleeping children mixed with Sandra's quick, shallow breaths. She pushed open the first door to reveal the boys' room. William Jr. and Nathaniel shared a bunk bed, with Billy on top and Nate curled up on the bottom with a stuffed dinosaur. They looked so small in their pajamas, completely unaware of what was happening around them. "We'll move Nate to the guest room," Sandra whispered. "You can watch Mary. I'll handle the boys." "Sandra, if we wake them up..." "We have to." Her voice carried that flat certainty that made my skin crawl. "It's almost 11:30. I watched her set the shotgun against the wall and gently shake Nathaniel awake. He mumbled something unintelligible and tried to turn away from her, but she persisted until his eyes opened. "Come on, sweetie. Mommy needs you to sleep in a different room tonight." "Why?" His voice was small and confused. "Just for tonight. It's like a game." Nate sat up, rubbing his eyes, and looked around the room until he spotted me standing in the doorway. "Miss Emily? What are you doing here?" "I'm helping your mom," I said, though the words felt like lies in my mouth. Sandra lifted Nathaniel from the bottom bunk, and he didn't resist, just buried his face against her shoulder, the way tired children do. She carried him across the hall to a smaller room that had a single bed and a dresser. I followed, watching her tuck him under covers that smelled like they hadn't been used in months. "Mommy, I want to go back to my room." "In the morning, baby. Just sleep here tonight, okay?" Sandra kissed his forehead, and for a moment she looked almost normal, almost like the mother these children deserved. Then she straightened up, and her expression got hard again. Now Mary's room was at the end of the hall, painted in soft pink with white furniture that looked like it had been put together from a box. She slept in a toddler bed shaped like a race car, her small body curled around a raggedy bunny that had clearly been loved hard. Sandra woke her more carefully than she had Nathaniel, stroking her hair and whispering her name until the little girl's eyes opened. "Mama?" "Hi, sweetheart. We're going to have a sleepover in Mommy and Daddy's room tonight." Mary didn't argue, just reached up to be carried. Sandra picked her up, and I saw something change in her face as she looked down at her daughter. Her expression became calculating, studying, like she was trying to remember details. William and Sandra's bedroom was bigger than the others, with a king-size bed and a small reading chair in the corner. Sandra placed Mary in the center of the bed, putting pillows around her. "Emily's going to sit right here and watch you sleep," Sandra told her daughter, "like a guardian angel." Mary looked at me with sleepy confusion, but didn't protest. She hugged her bunny tighter and closed her eyes, trusting in the way that only small children can. Sandra moved the reading chair so I could see both the bed and the door, then handed me a key. "Lock the door after I leave." Don't open it for anyone except me. What if she needs to use the bathroom? Knock on the wall 3 times and I'll come get her. Sandra picked up the shotgun again. But Emily, this is important. Don't take your eyes off her. Not even for a second. I wanted to ask what she thought a 2-year-old could possibly do that would require such vigilance, but Sandra was already heading for the door. She paused in the doorway and looked back at Mary, her face twisted with an expression I couldn't read. Remember, Em, that might not be my real daughter. The door closed with a soft click, and I turned the key in the lock as instructed. The room fell silent except for Mary's even breathing and my own breathing. I sat in the chair, still holding the knife, and tried to make sense of what was happening. Mary moved in her sleep, and I found myself looking at her face the way Sandra had. She looked like every other 2-year-old I'd ever seen. Round cheeks, long eyelashes, the kind of perfect skin that only children have. Her bunny had one ear that was more chewed than the other, and there was a small stain on her pajama top that looked like juice or maybe chocolate milk. Nothing about her seemed unusual or wrong or not human. She was just a little girl who'd been woken up in the middle of the night and moved to a strange room by adults who weren't explaining why. Footsteps moved through the house below us, and I heard Sandra's voice, though I couldn't make out words. She seemed to be talking to someone, but I knew the boys were locked in their rooms and William was still asleep, which meant she was either talking to herself or to someone I couldn't see. The clock on the nightstand read 11:47. More footsteps, faster now, moving between rooms. A door opened and closed somewhere in the house. Then another. Sandra's voice rose slightly, still unintelligible but more urgent. At exactly midnight, everything changed. A sound came from somewhere in the house. Not quite scratching, not quite tapping, but something rhythmic against glass. Sandra's voice became more agitated, and I heard her moving quickly through the rooms below us. "They're here," she called out, her voice carrying through the walls. "I can hear them at the windows." More scratching sounds, coming from different directions now. Some seemed to come from outside the bedroom windows, others from downstairs. But as I listened more carefully, I began to notice a pattern. The sounds followed Sandra's movements through the house. She was making them herself. Mary moved in the bed, making a small sound of distress. I wanted to comfort her, but Sandra's warnings repeated in my head. "Don't take your eyes off her. That might not be my real daughter. Oh God, they're trying to get in." Sandra's voice carried clearly now, coming from somewhere directly below us. "Emily, can you hear them? They know we're here." I heard what sounded like furniture being moved, something heavy scraping across the floor. Then rapid footsteps on the stairs, and Sandra's voice right outside the bedroom door. "Em, open up. I need to check on her. She's fine. She's sleeping. Open the door." I heard the shotgun barrel tap against the door frame. "Sandra, she hasn't moved. She's just a little girl sleeping. That's what they want you to think." Another tap, more insistent. "Open the door now." The handle turned but caught against the lock. Sandra tried it twice more, then moved away. I heard her footsteps going toward the boys' rooms, heard doors opening and closing, heard her voice speaking in soothing tones mixed with something more frantic. Mary's eyes opened, and she looked around the room, confused like a child who'd forgotten where she was. "Mama?" "She's coming, sweetie. Just rest." But instead of going back to sleep, Mary sat up and looked directly at me. Her blue eyes were alert now, focused in a way that made me uncomfortable. She didn't cry or call for her mother again. She just watched me with an expression that seemed too grown up for her age. Sandra's footsteps came back to the door with different sounds now, dragging like she was pulling something heavy across the floor. "Emily, I need you to come out here. Something's wrong with the boys." "What's wrong?" "Just come out. Bring her with you." I looked at Mary, who was still watching me with that unnaturally calm expression. For just a moment, I understood what Sandra meant about something being wrong. There was something off about the way she was looking at me. Something that didn't match what I'd expect from a frightened 2-year-old. Then Mary reached for her bunny, and the expression disappeared, replaced by normal childhood sleepiness. She rubbed her eyes and yawned, and I felt stupid for letting Sandra's paranoia infect my own thinking. "Emily," Sandra's voice was sharper now. "I can hear them getting closer. We need to move to the living room where I can see all the entrances." "Sandra, the children need to sleep. The children need to be protected." The shotgun barrel tapped against the door again, harder this time. "Unlock this door right now, or I'm going to assume you've been compromised too." I looked at the key in my hand, then at Mary, who had laid back down but kept her eyes open. Sandra's footsteps moved away from the door again, but this time they didn't go toward the other bedrooms. They went toward the stairs. She was giving up on getting me to open the door voluntarily, which meant she was going to try something else. "Emily, you have 30 seconds to bring Mary downstairs, or I'm coming up there with the shotgun and we'll settle this a different way." The house fell silent except for the sound of my own breathing and Mary's soft movements in the bed. I held the knife in my shaking hand and tried to figure out what choice would keep this little girl safest: staying locked in this room with her mother getting more desperate by the minute, or taking her downstairs where Sandra could watch her more closely. Neither option felt safe, but Sandra had the shotgun, and she'd already proven she was willing to use it to get what she wanted. "Okay," I called out. "We're coming down." I unlocked the door with hands I couldn't keep steady. Mary sat up in the bed, holding her bunny, and I knew I had to get her away from whatever Sandra was planning downstairs. But when I opened the door, Sandra stood right there in the hallway with the shotgun pointed at the floor, her face set in an expression I'd never seen before. "Good. Bring her." Mary reached for Sandra automatically, the way children do with their mothers, but Sandra stepped back. "Don't let her touch you yet. We need to do this properly." I picked up Mary instead, feeling her small arms wrap around my neck. She was warm and solid and completely trusting, and I wanted to run with her right then. But Sandra had the gun, and I could hear movement from the other bedrooms where the boys were locked away. "Sandra, please think about what you're doing." "I am thinking. That's the problem. I'm the only one who is." She gestured toward the stairs with the shotgun barrel. "Living room. Now." The boys' bedroom doors stood open now, and I could see both rooms were empty. Sandra had already moved them. My stomach dropped as I realized she'd been busier during those 30 seconds than I'd thought. Downstairs, the living room had been rearranged. The coffee table had been pushed against the wall, and 3 wooden chairs from the dining room sat in a line facing the couch. William Jr. and Nathaniel were already there, tied to their chairs with what looked like kitchen twine. Both boys were awake now, their eyes wide and scared. "Mama, why are we tied up?" Billy's voice came out small and confused. "It's a game, sweetheart. Just sit still for Mommy." But it wasn't a game, and even at 4 years old, Billy seemed to understand that. Nate was crying quietly, the kind of tears that just rolled down without any sound. Seeing them like that made something break inside me. "Sandra, untie them. They're scared. They should be scared. One of them isn't who we think it is." Sandra gestured to the empty chair in the middle. Put her there. I looked at Mary, who was starting to fuss in my arms, picking up on the tension in the room. I won't tie up a baby. Then I will. Sandra set the shotgun against the wall within easy reach and pulled a length of twine from her pocket. She moved toward us, and Mary began to cry in earnest now, sensing something wrong in her mother's approach. Mama, want Mama. Shh, it's okay, baby. Mommy just needs to make sure you're really my Mary. The words didn't make sense to a 2-year-old, but the rope did. Mary struggled in my arms as Sandra tried to tie her to the chair, her cries getting louder and more desperate. I wanted to fight, to grab Mary and run, but Sandra kept looking toward the shotgun, and I knew she'd use it if I tried to leave. There. Sandra stepped back once Mary was secured, though she'd tied the rope looser than she had with the boys. Now we can begin the test. She walked to a bookshelf in the corner and pulled out a photo album, flipping through pages until she found what she was looking for. She pulled out a single photograph and held it up so I could see it. It was Sandra from maybe 10 years ago, standing in front of what looked like a college dormitory. Her hair was different, shorter, and she was smiling in a way that made her look like a completely different person. Happy, carefree. Nothing like the woman who stood in front of me now. This is how I used to look, Sandra said, holding the photo like it was some kind of religious artifact. Before they started watching me, before they began their preparations. Sandra, what does this have to do with... The real children will remember this version of me. The imposter won't, because it only has access to recent memories, the stolen ones. She turned toward the children, all 3 of whom were watching her with the kind of attention kids give adults when they're trying to figure out if they're in trouble. We'll show them the picture and see who reacts. I watched her approach Billy first, holding the photograph in front of his face. He looked at it with the polite interest of a child being shown something by a grown-up, but nothing more. His eyes moved from the picture to Sandra's face and back again. Do you know who this is, Billy? He studied the photo more carefully, his small forehead creasing in concentration. Is it you, Mama? Do you remember me looking like this? Billy shook his head. You look different. Sandra's face lit up with something that might have been relief. She moved to Nathaniel next, showing him the same photograph. Nate was still crying quietly, and he barely looked at the picture before turning his head away. Nate, honey, look at the picture. Don't want to. Please, baby. Just look. She held his chin gently and turned his face toward the photograph. Nate glanced at it and immediately looked away again, pressing his lips together in the stubborn way 3-year-olds do when they've decided not to cooperate. Good, Sandra murmured. Very good. Then she turned to Mary. The little girl had stopped crying while watching her mother interact with her brothers, but she started up again when Sandra came closer with the photograph. Mary's reaction was immediate and devastating. Her face crumpled, and she reached toward Sandra with both hands, pulling against the rope. Mama! Want Mama! Sandra's expression changed completely. The relief disappeared, replaced by something cold and terrible. No, she whispered. Oh no. No. Sandra, she's just upset. She wants you to comfort her. She recognizes me. Sandra's voice was flat, emotionless. She can see past the changes they've made to me. That's how they work. They implant memories, emotions, connections to the original family. But they can't replicate everything. Mary continued to cry and reach for her mother, and Sandra stared down at her like she was looking at a snake. This proves it. The boys don't remember this version of me because they're still my real children. Their memories are intact, uncompromised. But she knows me in ways she shouldn't. Ways that mean she has access to stolen information. Sandra, listen to yourself. You're talking about your baby daughter. I'm talking about the thing wearing my baby daughter's face. Sandra picked up the shotgun again, her movements sharp and purposeful. The boys barely reacted to the photo because their natural childhood development means they don't have strong visual memories from when they were infants. But she does. She recognizes features, expressions, details that a normal 2-year-old couldn't possibly retain. I watched Mary strain against the rope, calling for her mama with increasing desperation, and felt my own desperation rise to match it. Sandra's logic was twisted but internally consistent, the kind of paranoid reasoning that built on itself until it became unshakable. Even if you were right, which you're not, what would you do? She's still a child. She's not a child. She's a replacement, a copy designed to infiltrate my family and gather information for the hunt. Sandra raised the shotgun, pointing it directly at Mary. I have to eliminate the threat before it can signal the others. Sandra, no. Mary looked up at the gun barrel without understanding what it meant, her tears slowing as confusion replaced fear. She was too young to understand the concept of weapons or death. All she knew was that her mama was acting strange and she wanted to be held. Mama, I'm sorry, Sandra said, and I heard genuine grief in her voice. I'm so sorry, but I have to protect the real ones. I moved toward her, but she shifted the gun in my direction without taking her eyes off Mary. Don't. I know this is hard to watch, but it has to be done. Sandra, please, just think for one more minute. Look at her. Really look at her. I have been looking at her for weeks, studying her, learning her patterns, documenting the inconsistencies. Sandra's finger moved to the trigger. She doesn't laugh the same way. She doesn't play with her toys the same way. Little differences that add up to one inescapable conclusion. Mary had gone quiet now, perhaps sensing the gravity of the moment even if she couldn't understand it. She looked between Sandra and me with wide blue eyes, her bottom lip trembling. Bye-bye, Mama. The question broke something in my chest, but it seemed to solidify Sandra's resolve. She steadied the gun against her shoulder. It's trying to manipulate me, using emotional triggers, childhood speech patterns, learned behaviors designed to activate maternal protective instincts. Sandra's voice was clinical now, detached. That's exactly what they would program it to do. Sandra, stop! The gunshot exploded through the living room, deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. I felt the sound hit me hard, ringing in my ears and bouncing off the walls. Mary's small body jerked once, and then went still, slumping against the rope that held her to the chair. For a moment, everything was silent, except for the ringing in my ears and my own ragged breathing. Then Billy began to laugh. It wasn't the normal laughter of a 4-year-old. It was high-pitched and rhythmic, almost mechanical in its consistency. He sat in his chair, still tied up, and laughed with his head tilted back and his mouth wide open. The sound went on, filling the room with something that felt far more disturbing than screaming would have been. Sandra lowered the shotgun and stared at him, her face going pale. "Oh God," she whispered. "I got the wrong one." I stood frozen in the aftermath of the gunshot, my ears still ringing from the explosive sound, the smell of gunpowder mixed with the sudden metallic scent of blood. But Billy's laughter kept going, that awful mechanical sound that seemed to fill every corner of the room. Sandra lowered the shotgun and looked at her surviving son, her face changing from grim satisfaction to growing horror as the laughter continued. Billy sat rigid in his chair, his head thrown back, his mouth stretched wide as that rhythmic sound poured out of him. It wasn't joy or relief or anything remotely normal. It was the sound of a child's mind breaking under trauma. "No," Sandra whispered, watching him. "No, that's not right. He should be calm now. He should be relieved." I could see it happening in real time. The realization moving across Sandra's face as she understood that Billy's reaction wasn't supernatural. It was the response of a 4-year-old boy who had just watched his mother murder his baby sister. His brain had broken under something too terrible to process, and the laughter was how it came out. Nathaniel had gone completely still in his chair, his eyes wide and empty, staring at nothing. He wasn't crying anymore. He wasn't moving at all, just sitting there like his mind had simply shut down rather than deal with what he'd seen. "Oh God," Sandra breathed, looking between her sons. "Oh God, what have I done?" But then Billy's laughter shifted, became more frantic, and I watched Sandra's expression change again. The brief moment of clarity vanished, replaced by renewed fear. "It's him," she said, raising the shotgun toward Billy. "The laughter. It's a signal. He's calling them." "Sandra, no!" I lunged toward her as she swung the gun around. "He's having a breakdown. He's just a little boy." "He's not my boy." Sandra's voice cracked as she fought to keep the weapon pointed at Billy. "Listen to him. That's not how children laugh." I grabbed for the shotgun barrel and Sandra pulled it away from me. We struggled, both of us pulling at the weapon while Billy's mechanical laughter continued in the background. Sandra was stronger than I expected, her desperation giving her extra force, but I was taller and managed to get both hands on the gun. "Let go!" Sandra yanked hard to the right, and my grip slipped. The gun went off again, the sound even louder this time. Chunks of ceiling plaster rained down on us as the shotgun blast tore through the room above. Sandra stumbled backward from the recoil, and I used the moment to pull the weapon completely away from her. She dropped to her knees, staring at Mary's body with complete shock. The fight went out of her all at once, leaving her on the living room floor. "My baby," she whispered. "My little girl. What did I do to my little girl?" Billy's laughter finally stopped, replaced by a different sound. A low, crying wail that was somehow worse than the laughter had been. He rocked back and forth in his chair, the rope cutting into his small wrists as he moved. I put the shotgun against the far wall and pulled out my phone with shaking hands. 911 felt surreal to say out loud, like words from a movie rather than something I actually needed. "Emergency services. What's your emergency?" "I need police and paramedics. A child has been shot. The shooter is contained, but there are other children who need medical attention." I gave them the address on Maple Street while moving toward Billy to untie his restraints. His wails got louder when I touched the rope, but I managed to free his hands. He immediately brought them up to his face, covering his eyes while continuing to rock. Nathaniel didn't react when I untied him. He just sat there staring at the wall, completely disconnected from everything around him. When I lifted him from the chair, his body was limp and unresponsive. "They're coming," Sandra said from the floor. She wasn't talking to me. She was talking to Mary's body. "I was supposed to protect you. I was supposed to keep you safe from them." Heavy footsteps thundered down the stairs, and William appeared in the living room doorway in his pajama pants and undershirt. His hair stuck up in all directions, and his eyes were wide with confusion as he took in the scene. The blood, the destroyed ceiling, Sandra on the floor, me holding Nathaniel while Billy wailed in the corner. "What the hell happened here?" His voice came out hoarse, like he'd been sleeping deeply. "I heard gunshots. Where's Mary?" Sandra looked up at him from the floor, her face streaked with tears. "William, I'm sorry. I thought she wasn't ours." I thought something had taken her. William's eyes found Mary's body in the chair, and his face went completely white. He stood there for a long moment, not moving, not speaking, just staring at his dead daughter. "You killed her," he said finally. "You killed our baby." "She wasn't ours anymore," Sandra whispered. "I was protecting the real children." "Sandra, she was 2 years old. She was our daughter." William's voice broke on the last word. "How could you think she was anything else?" Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. I could hear multiple vehicles, police cars, ambulances, probably fire trucks too. The kind of response that meant this quiet street was about to become the center of a lot of attention. William moved toward Sandra, but stopped when he saw the blood on her clothes. "How long has this been going on?" "The paranoia, the watching them constantly." "Months," Sandra said. "It's been getting worse for months. Ever since Mary was born, they've been trying to replace them one by one." "There is no they, Sandra. There never was." William ran his hands through his hair, leaving it even more disheveled. "I should have made you get help. I should have done something when you started talking about people watching the house." The sirens were right outside now, multiple vehicles pulling up in front of the house. Red and blue lights flashed through the living room windows, casting everything in an alternating glow that made the blood look even darker. "I knew something was wrong," William continued, his voice getting louder. "You stopped sleeping, stopped eating. You'd sit by their beds for hours just watching them. I thought it was postpartum depression. I thought it would get better on its own." "Sir, police! We need you to come to the front door with your hands visible." William looked at me holding Nathaniel, then at Sandra on the floor, then at Mary's body. "This is my fault. I knew she was getting sick, and I didn't do anything about it." "Go let them in," I said. "They need to help the boys." Billy had stopped crying, but was still rocking, his hands pressed against his ears. Nathaniel stayed completely limp in my arms, his breathing shallow and quick. Both of them needed medical attention, and Mary needed a coroner. William walked toward the front door, calling out that he was coming. I heard him explaining to the officers, his voice carrying through the house as more vehicles arrived outside. Sandra hadn't moved from the floor, just kept staring at Mary and whispering apologies that were far too late to matter. The house filled with voices and radio chatter as emergency responders moved through the rooms. A paramedic knelt beside Sandra while 2 others approached the children. Someone else started documenting the scene with a camera, the flash adding to the already chaotic lighting. Through it all, I kept thinking about the woman I'd known in college, the Sandra who'd helped me study, who'd laughed at terrible movies, who'd been excited about getting married and starting a family. That person was gone now, replaced by someone who could convince herself that murdering her own child was an act of protection. A detective approached me as the paramedics took Nathaniel from my arms. "Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions about what happened here tonight." I looked back at Mary one more time before they covered her body. She still looked like she was sleeping, like she might wake up any moment and ask for her mama. But Sandra had made sure that would never happen, and now everyone would have to live with the consequences of her delusions. "Yes," I said to the detective. "I'll tell you everything." I spent the next 12 hours in various sterile rooms, answering the same questions over and over again. The police station, the social services office, the victim advocate's cramped space next to the courthouse. Each time I walked through the events of the night before, trying to make sense of words like postpartum psychosis and temporary custody, while my mind kept going back to Mary's small body slumped in that dining room chair. The detective who'd taken my initial statement was a patient woman named Reynolds who'd worked cases involving mental health crises before. She explained that Sandra had been taken to the regional psychiatric facility in Columbus immediately after being processed at the scene. William had been questioned separately but wasn't considered a suspect. The neighbors had confirmed he'd been asleep upstairs when the shooting happened. Social services had acted quickly to remove Billy and Nathaniel from the home. A caseworker named Mrs. Chen walked me through the process, explaining that the boys were in emergency foster care while the state looked at William's ability to care for them. Both children would need extensive psychological checkups and therapy before any decisions could be made about their permanent placement. "The father seems cooperative," Mrs. Chen said, reviewing her notes. "He's agreed to counseling and parenting classes. He's also been honest about his wife's deteriorating mental state over the past several months." That was when I learned the details that made everything even more tragic. William had noticed Sandra's increasing paranoia and erratic behavior, but had blamed it on normal new mother anxiety. She'd been staying awake for days at a time, claiming she needed to watch the children. She'd started checking and rechecking locks, insisting someone was trying to get into the house. She'd begun separating the children's belongings, convinced that some items had been contaminated or replaced. The local family doctor, Dr. Martinez, confirmed that Sandra had been prescribed antidepressants 3 months after Mary's birth. The medication had initially helped with what appeared to be postpartum depression, but Sandra had stopped taking it after only 6 weeks. She'd told William the pills made her feel foggy and unable to properly protect the children. She was convinced the medication was deliberately designed to make her vulnerable, Dr. Martinez explained when I spoke with him later that afternoon. She believed it was part of some larger conspiracy to gain access to her family. What made it worse was learning how many people had noticed something was wrong but hadn't acted on their concerns. The neighbor across the street, Mrs. Patterson, had seen Sandra standing at her front window for hours at a time, just watching the street. The mailman had mentioned to several people that Sandra would rush outside the moment he approached, as if she was afraid he might leave something dangerous. Everyone thought it was just new mother stress, Mrs. Patterson told me when I stopped by the house to collect my things. She had 3 little ones, and we all figured she was just overwhelmed. We should have done something. The grocery store clerk remembered Sandra coming in with increasingly elaborate lists of safe foods, convinced that certain brands or products had been tampered with. She'd started buying only items from specific aisles and would spend an hour examining packaging for signs of interference. "She seemed so sure of herself," the clerk said, "like she knew something the rest of us didn't. It was unsettling, but she wasn't aggressive or anything. Just intense." William was staying at his brother's house while the investigation continued, and their home remained a crime scene. When I met with him at the social services office, he looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. His eyes were red-rimmed and his hands shook when he tried to drink coffee. "I knew something was wrong," he said, staring at the table between us. "She stopped eating regularly. She'd forget to shower for days, but she was so good at hiding it when other people were around. She could pull herself together for a doctor's appointment or a trip to the store." He explained that Sandra had become more and more isolated after Mary's birth, turning down invitations from other mothers and avoiding social situations. She'd convinced him that she was just tired, that she needed time to adjust to having 3 children. He'd taken on extra shifts at the plant to help with finances, which meant he was home less often to witness the worst of her behavior. The night before it happened, she seemed almost normal, William continued. She made dinner, helped the kids get ready for bed, asked me about my day. I thought maybe she was getting better on her own. The caseworker explained that this was common with postpartum psychosis. patients often experienced periods of apparent normalcy between episodes. Sandra had likely been planning her actions for days or weeks, waiting for the right moment when she felt confident in her delusions. The psychiatric evaluation will determine her competency for trial, Mrs. Chen said, but regardless of the legal outcome, she'll need long-term treatment. The children will need extensive therapy as well, especially the older boy. Billy had been placed with a foster family experienced in trauma cases. He hadn't spoken since the night of the shooting, communicating only through gestures and occasionally breaking into that same mechanical laughter that had convinced Sandra he was somehow compromised. Nathaniel was with a different family and had regressed to behaviors typical of a much younger child, refusing solid food and asking constantly for his mother. By evening, I was finally allowed to visit Sandra at the psychiatric facility. The building looked more like a medical center than the institutional setting I'd expected, with pale green walls and carefully designed common areas meant to feel calming rather than confining. Sandra was in a secure unit on the third floor, and I had to go through multiple checkpoints and sign various forms before being allowed to see her. The visiting room was small and sterile, with plastic chairs and a table bolted to the floor. Security cameras watched from every corner. When they brought Sandra in, I barely recognized her again. She moved slowly, her eyes unfocused from medication, and her dark hair hung limp around her face. She wore standard hospital clothing, light blue scrubs that made her skin look even paler than before. But the frantic energy that had driven her the night before was completely gone, replaced by a heavy drugged lethargy. "Emily?" Her voice sounded thick and uncertain. "Are you really here?" "Yes, I'm here." Sandra sat down across from me and stared at her hands for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were clearer than they'd been in months, but filled with a confusion that was somehow worse than the certainty she'd shown before. "They tell me Mary is dead," she said quietly. "They tell me I killed her." "Yes. I don't remember it clearly. I remember being afraid. I remember thinking something was wrong with her, that she wasn't really mine." Sandra's voice was flat, emotionless in the way that heavy medication can make someone sound. But I can't remember why I thought that. It doesn't make sense anymore. A psychiatrist named Dr. Reeves had explained Sandra's condition to me before the visit. Postpartum psychosis was rare but serious, affecting roughly 1 in 1,000 new mothers. Unlike postpartum depression, which was mood-based, psychosis involved a complete break from reality. Delusions, hallucinations, and paranoid thinking were common symptoms, often focused on threats to the children that weren't really there. "The good news is that it's very treatable," Dr. Reeves had said. "With proper medication and therapy, most patients make a full recovery. But the path back to wellness can be long and difficult, especially when there are serious consequences to work through." Sandra would probably be hospitalized for several months, while doctors changed her medication and helped her deal with what had happened. Even after leaving the hospital, she'd need ongoing therapy and close watching. The legal system would figure out if she was responsible, but Dr. Reeves believed that with treatment, Sandra could eventually understand and take responsibility for her actions. "I keep thinking about her little face," Sandra said during our visit. "I keep remembering how she reached for me, how she called me Mama. I thought that was proof she wasn't really mine, but now I realize she was just scared. She wanted her mother to comfort her, and instead She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The weight of what she'd done was settling on her as the delusions faded, and I could see it crushing her with every breath. "The boys," she said suddenly. "Are Billy and Nate okay? Are they safe? They're in foster care. They're getting help. Do they understand what happened?" Do they know why mommy isn't there? I didn't know how to answer that. How do you explain to a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old that their mother killed their sister because she thought monsters were coming for them? How do you help children that young handle trauma that most adults couldn't deal with? They're being taken care of, I said instead. They have people helping them. Sandra nodded slowly, as if this information was taking time to get through the fog of medication and grief. I was supposed to protect them. That's what mothers do. We protect our children from danger. But there was no danger, was there? I was the danger. You were sick, Sandra. This wasn't your fault. But I still did it. Whatever was wrong with my mind, I still made the choice. I still pulled that trigger. She looked up at me with eyes that were completely lucid for the first time since I'd arrived in Millbrook. How do I live with that? How do I wake up every day knowing I murdered my own child? I didn't have an answer for that either. The psychiatrist had mentioned that guilt and self-harm were major concerns during recovery from postpartum psychosis, especially in cases where the delusions had led to violence. Sandra would need intensive therapy to work through her actions and find a way to move forward. The visit ended after 30 minutes, when Sandra became too tired to continue talking. The medication made her drowsy, and Dr. Reeves had warned that she'd need to sleep frequently as her brain worked to heal itself. As they led her back to her room, she turned to look at me one more time. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I know this isn't what you expected when I called you." That night, I drove back to my hotel in Columbus and sat in the parking lot for an hour before going inside. The events of the past 2 days felt unreal, like something that had happened to someone else. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mary's small face and heard Billy's mechanical laughter bouncing through that destroyed living room. I'd come to Millbrook because an old friend had asked for help. Instead, I'd seen the complete destruction of a family and the loss of an innocent child. Sandra might recover with treatment, but Mary would never come back. Billy and Nathaniel would carry the trauma of that night for the rest of their lives. William would have to rebuild his entire world while supporting children who might never fully trust adults again. The woman I'd known in college was gone, replaced first by delusions and paranoia, then by medication and overwhelming guilt. Whatever friendship we'd once shared had ended the moment Sandra pointed that shotgun at her own daughter. There was no coming back from that, no matter how effective the treatment might be. I finally went inside and called my supervisor to request extended leave. I'd need time to process what I'd seen and probably therapy of my own to work through the trauma. But mostly, I needed to understand how someone I'd once trusted completely could become capable of such unthinkable violence, and how I'd failed to recognize the depth of her illness until it was far too late to save anyone.